In this particular video session, we continue our discussion on real wages, and we are looking at how the real wage can actually impact output and also employment. So in this slide, what we see here is a table, and we see a diagram with the demand curve for labor and the supply curve of labor. And what we see here simply on this table is that as the real wage moves from 180 to 50, so it moves from a high real wage to a low real wage, the demand for labor increases. However, in terms of the supply of labor, laborers willing to work, the demand for the number of people willing to work is actually decreasing from 7 workers moving to 1. And this phenomenon actually corroborates what we would have discussed before, in that, remember, the real wage is a cost to the firm. The higher the cost, the lower the demand. The lower the cost, the higher the demand. However, the real wage is a benefit to laborers who are willing to work. So the higher the real wage is the higher the benefit, and therefore the more willing to work. The lower the real wage, the lower the benefit or incentive to the worker, and the lower number of workers being willing to work. So therefore we see there's a negative relationship that exists between the real wage and the demand for labor, which gives rise to a downward sloping demand curve from left to right. And there's a positive or direct relationship that exists between the supply of labor and the real wage, which gives rise to an upward sloping supply curve from left to right. Therefore, we see that at equilibrium, the equilibrium real wage in this particular diagram equates to 100, and the equilibrium level of employment is 4 workers. So what we see is that 4 workers are willing to work for a real wage of 100, and firms are willing to demand 4 workers for a real wage of 100. That is the equilibrium wage rate. Now, how does the real wage affect output? Let's first analyze output. What we have here is a production function, or a diagram that simply shows the relationship between the quantity of labor and output. Therefore, what we're saying here is that as the quantity of labor increases, as the level of employment increases, shown by the quantity of labor, we realize that the level of output also increases. So when labor employed is at QL, the amount of output starts at Y. However, when labor increases from QL to QL1, we also see an increase in output come up, go across, and output increases from Y to Y1. So we see a positive relationship between the labor force and output. And we could rationalize this. As was stated earlier, firms demand workers in order to produce. And the more workers that firms hire is the more output that firms can produce. Therefore, there's a positive relationship that exists between the quantity of labor that is employed and the level of output within an economy. Now, if we take this diagram and we superimpose it, or we join it with the diagram of the demand and supply curve for labor, what we can say is this. Do you realize that at the equilibrium wage, we said that the number of workers that find employment will be 4 workers? When we bring this line down, because this axis here represents the quantity of labor, similarly, this axis also represents quantity of labor, so therefore we can match these two axes up. This axis, however, looks at output. This axis looks at the real wage. So what we're saying here currently is this. At a real wage of 100, 4 workers are employed. When 4 workers are employed, that is, the quantity of labor in this market is 4, you have a level of output that is this high. So we realize that at equilibrium, the level of employment is determined And when you look at this diagram, we can use the level of employment to determine what the level of output would be. So we can intuitively determine that anytime there's a change in the equilibrium position in the labor market, there will be a change in the level of output. Thus, anything that can cause your demand curve for labor or your supply curve for labor to shift, which will bring about a new equilibrium position, it will also result in a new level of output taking place. We can see that in this following diagram, whereby we see that the supply curve, the initial curve was purple, the new supply curve for labor is green. So therefore there's been a shift to the left in supply for whatever reason. And so what we're seeing here is that there's a lower supply of workers in this particular economy. There's a possibility that whatever sector this is, they may have experienced a number of workers migrating, going abroad, leaving the sector. Persons may no longer desire to work in this particular sector or work in this particular firm. So therefore, the less persons that are willing to work in this sector, it means the less persons that they are possible to hire. So there's a lower, so whatever is the reason, there's a lower supply of labor, which is basically illustrated by this green supply curve for labor. And therefore, what we see is a new equilibrium position, a lower equilibrium quantity. We see about approximately 2 workers being hired at a real wage of 140. And when you bring this down onto your production function, we see that there's a lower level of output within the economy, because output was once at Y, now it's at Y1, and quantity of labor was once at Q, now it's at Q1, simply because there was a fall in the level of the supply of labor, which brought about a new equilibrium position and therefore a new level of output. So as I said, anything that can bring about a new equilibrium position, which can occur because the demand curve for labor, the supply curve for labor shifted, is going to bring about a new level of equilibrium output. Alright, so ultimately we see, if we can wrap everything up, we realize that wages are determined in the labor market. We have to analyze the demand for labor. We realize it comes from firms, and we have to analyze the supply of labor. The supply of labor comes from consumers, it comes from the households who want an income, and therefore they go to work for the firms. The demand curve for labor is downward sloping from left to right. The supply curve for labor is upward sloping from left to right. Having these two curves in the model where there's equilibrium, it gives rise to equilibrium real wage and equilibrium level of employment. In that, we see 4 workers will actually supply their labor and 4 workers will be hired. These 4 workers, therefore, can be transferred to this particular curve where we see it. 4 workers, we bring it down, and therefore Q represents the 4 workers from the labor market. So Q is the quantity of labor, and this level of employment will bring about this level Y of output. As I said earlier, with a shift of your supply curve of labor to the left, it means that there's a lower supply of labor in this particular industry, this particular sector, this particular firm. This, as I said, could arise simply because there could have been migration in the country, or there could be a number of workers who have decided to change professions, move away from this particular sector. Whatever is the reason, there's now a lower supply curve, there's now a lower supply of labor, which therefore is reflected by a shift to the left in your supply curve of labor. And therefore, when you look at this equilibrium position, this is the number of workers that will be employed in equilibrium. This is the equilibrium level of employment, sorry. And then when you bring it down onto your production function, Q1 is the new level, right, of employment. Same quantity of labor axis. So, new equilibrium, Q1, the new level of output will now be Y1, which is a lower level. And this occurred simply because of a shifting of your supply curve to the left, which means a higher real wage, which means a lower level of equilibrium employment, meaning less workers will be employed at a higher real wage, and if less workers are employed, then it's going to be a lower level of output. Hence, we see how the real wage impacts not simply the demand for labor, nor the supply of labor, but also the level of employment within a country, and by extension, therefore, the level of output that can be produced by the workers in said country. So I hope this particular video session was clear, and stay tuned to future videos with future economic concepts. Thank you.